factors that go into scoring. So I'll talk a little bit through that here in a second. And then the other change would be sort of an update, an obvious update to the fact that we've got new projects, we've got new data about projects, and of course we have reset our analysis on the existing conditions and trends for the areas around these projects. So there's a huge data refresh on top of some minor tweaks to the structure of our scoring methodology. But as we get into this, sometimes the initial conversations about project scoring can be filled with anxiety for applicants. And there's no need for that, really. It's important to remember that the scoring is not our end goal. It's just simply a way to organize the hundreds of projects that we're looking at. They're all competing for limited funding. We're trying to find the priorities that are out there to achieve the regional goals that have been set by the policy board. And often these goals have competing objectives within. And so the scoring is just a way to sort of take stock of what's out there and assess each project for its individual ability to achieve as much of that goal set as possible. In the end, what ultimately determines which projects are funded through the plan is a combination of variables. The scoring is one of them, but the grant eligibility of the funding sources that we have available play into this. And so there are certain projects can only be funded by certain grants. And so the flow of money is going to determine to a great extent which projects ultimately get funding through the plan. And then the other is scheduling. And so obviously projects that have a more sense of urgency or have some programming history already or just generally more near term, they're going to be looked at more favorably regardless of the project score that is calculated through the methodology that we're going to be talking about today. Then in the end, one of the things that I like to remind the applicants of is that we update our regional transportation plan every 5 years. And so if your project isn't identified for funding through that 25-year horizon that we're scheduling for with this plan, there will be another opportunity 5 years from now for you to get your plan funded. What we're really trying to make sure we do is not leave out in the cold any projects that are ready for programming. So that's really the priorities, just to make sure that the fiscally constrained project list that will result from this process is inclusive of all the short-term priorities that you have, as well, in particular, those that sort of meet the regional goals and objectives that have been laid out by the policy board. So just keep that in mind as we go through this and take the scoring result with the somewhat of it's important, but take it with a grain of salt that it's sort of just a piece of the puzzle that we're working with here. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, Sean. And so this is just a reminder that what we're going to be talking today with respect to the scoring is derived from the policy framework that was initially put into place for this plan update in October of 2019. It's been updated a few different times through endorsements by the policy board to incorporate some additional work that's been done by staff and the technical, the Transportation Coordinating Committee, you folks, over the last couple of months. So it's a living document that initially got started back in October, but from this policy framework, we have derived the regional goals, and we'll talk about the 6 goal areas here in a second. And then in terms of the sort of the individual scoring elements within each of these goals, those are guided in large part by the objectives and then the measures that are on the table to help us understand if we're achieving our goals over the long term. So again, the scoring element here is derived from this policy framework, which has been in place since October. So let's go ahead and move to that next slide. And y'all will all remember during the September TCC and Transportation Policy Board meetings, a discussion about how to weight the relative importance among the set of goals or between the set of goals. The goals being on the screen here: state of good repair, improving roadway safety, managing congestion, providing economic opportunity, minimizing disruption of our transportation improvements, and aligning our regional investments with plans that are already in place, either at the local, regional, or state level. So those are the goal areas that have been identified since October of 2019. And then last month, what we did is we assigned a relative weight of importance between them. The leading or the most important goal through the pairwise process that y'all participated in was to improve roadway safety at 30% out of 100 possible, sort of out of a universe of, if this all adds up to 100, 30% of that would be sort of weighted towards roadway safety improvement projects. State of good repair and maintenance was second, and then congestion management and economic opportunity were third, and then minimizing disruption and aligning with plans were at 10% each. This slide is actually got a typo. Those two should be 10%. So that was a look at the weighting of importance between the goal areas. And so now in the next couple of slides, we're going to share with you the factors within each of these areas that are playing into the calculation of a project score. So Sean, go ahead and move on to the next slide. We'll take the top three here: state of good repair, roadway safety, and congestion management. And so I'm going to list through each one of these the characteristics that are derived from the sources of information that we have, that when a condition or characteristic exists is going to give a project a more favorable outcome in terms of scoring. So in the sense of state of good repair, we're looking at what the primary objective of this project is that you've proposed. When you fill out your application, you indicated the primary objective. And if you indicated that it is to maintain or repair the system, then that's an opportunity for you to score well within this category. But beyond, just sort of your stated objective, we're also looking at the existing conditions and trends on the ground that are sort of creating a situation that is conducive for having maintenance and repairs. And we're also looking at the proposed features or elements of your project that you indicated to us through the application. So if you said like you're going to be doing roadway maintenance as part of your project within the scope of work, in the check boxes that you filled out, you're going to be given some credit here in this category. So let me just go through these. So we're looking at prioritizing routes that are on the NHS or the Strategic Highway Network. We're looking at prioritizing routes that have higher traffic volumes, higher freight volumes, that have bridges that are in fair or poor condition, and when you are proposing features within the project that relate to repair and maintenance. And so as your project has sort of the area conditions that relate to these elements, or you've proposed features related to repair and maintenance, you're likely to score well in this category. Moving over to roadway safety, we're looking at projects where the primary objective is to improve safety, but we're also looking for projects to reward projects that are in high crash areas or on routes with crashes that involve fatalities, crashes that involve bike ped users, and crashes that involve trucks. And then we're also looking at your project scope and the features that you are proposing within that relate to improving safety. Within congestion management, we're looking at any instance where you indicated the primary objective is to mitigate congestion, but we're also looking to see if your proposed project is in a congested condition, either today or in the future, whether it's congested because the travel speeds are estimated or forecasted to be below the expected free flow, or if the volume capacity ratio would indicate congestion. We're also looking to see if your project is in an area of high active transportation demand, which would make it suitable for multimodal investments as a congestion management strategy. So this is transit, walking, and biking demand that we've measured across the region. We're looking at the underlying bicycle and pedestrian level of service for the route that you're trying to improve, and we're prioritizing routes with a low level of service for walking and biking. And then we're also, we've worked with our Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee to identify the areas within the region that are the most important for investments in walking and biking. And they develop their own methodology to identify those areas of importance. But when your project falls within an area that is determined to be of high importance for walking and biking investments, particularly as a way of managing congestion through multimodal opportunities, and then you propose those multimodal improvements, you're likely to be rewarded for that through this process. And then again, any of the features of the scope of work that relate to mitigating congestion are rewarded within this category. The features are grouped into the four CMP, the congestion management process, identified four strategy areas: operations improvements, multimodal opportunities, capacity improvements, and managing transportation demand. So we've grouped the features that you may have identified into one of those strategies, and then when you are essentially checking one of those boxes related to the strategy, you're going to be rewarded within this category of congestion management. So let's move on to the final three scoring categories, Sean, on the next slide. Okay, so we start here with economic opportunities. So you're going to be rewarded in this category if you indicated that the primary objective of the project is to increase economic access. But you're also going to be rewarded if the project is happening within a planned growth area. And so this is where we rely a lot on some of the local planning work that's identifying planned growth areas that we can ascertain either from your input or through our analysis. But we're relying heavily on urban growth boundaries as being a proxy for sort of the anticipated expansion of our urban footprint into the future. We're also looking at high growth areas as they are forecasted. As you know, we have a 2040 population employment forecast allocated to the parcel level. A lot of that is influenced directly by the economic trends and the market forces that are going to be driving growth and development to the future. And so projects that are occurring in high growth areas to support the economic opportunity that's anticipated across the region are going to be rewarded within this category. Projects that are serving high employment centers are going to be rewarded. And then projects that are on routes with high commercial vehicle activity will be rewarded in this category. And then finally, we're also looking at your scope of work for elements that are the typical type of investments that are sort of go in before a major economic development investment, things like streetscaping, curb and gutter upgrades, a new capacity largely with on the main roads and interstate interchanges and so on and so forth. So when you're doing things in this list, you would be rewarded with an economic opportunity category. And then we move on to minimizing disruption, which is the fifth goal area of the policy framework. And what we're doing here is essentially starting every project off with the maximum number of points, and then we're taking deductions in cases where the project is running into anticipated conflicts with either the natural environment or the vulnerable communities that exist across the region. So here we're looking at the overlap with environmental conflicts. And so Ben Gramlin and the staff working with our environmental roundtable have identified a set of environmentally sensitive areas, and we're looking to see what percentage of your project's length is traversing through at least one of those types of areas. So that's a consideration here. And so the more you're overlapping, the more points that will be deducted in this category. We're also looking at the sort of just the proximity of your project to the number of those environmentally sensitive areas. There's a list of, I think, 8 or 9 environmentally sensitive area layers that we've identified. So we're counting the number of areas that you are in close proximity to with your alignment. And then finally, we're looking at proximity to vulnerable communities. And in particular, we're looking at how a physical investment may be sort of disproportionately impacting these communities in a negative way. So that's a look at this category and the things that would lead to deductions of that maximum point total associated with this goal area. And then finally, the alignment with other plans. This is really aimed at prioritizing projects that are have programming histories, either some obligation already or commitments already made through the TIP or the Improve Act. or projects that really have a sense of urgency to move in the short term. So projects that sort of check those boxes are going to fare well in this category. And then projects that are specific recommendations from a local plan or a local, regional, state study are going to be rewarded within this category. We also include in this category this overlap with environmental challenges. And so this is analysis that's done within the environmental framework that I just mentioned that Ben leads for us. But the twist here is that whereas in the minimize disruption goal area, we're looking at where the project may cause a disruptive or pose a disruptive sort of reaction within the environment. In this category, alignment with other plans, we're looking at where the environment may make your improvement a bit more challenging to get implemented, either make it sort of more time consuming or just it might make it cost a lot more money because the things that you're trying to do to mitigate the impacts that you might have on the environment. So that's a consideration within this goal area here. And so that's a look at the list of sort of elements that we're looking at to either reward or penalize your project from a scoring standpoint. And so, Sean, if you go to the next slide, let me talk a little bit more about the sources of information that we use to reward or deduct points within those scoring categories. And so there's three sources of information, and most of you are likely very familiar with these already, but some of the information that we use comes directly from your applications that you submit through apply.nashvilleinpo.org. We're looking at your project description to include its location and proposed scope of work. We're looking at the project history and the anticipated cost estimates that you've provided. And we're looking at the project's purpose, goals, and objectives. And so where that information is being used to ultimately assign point totals within each of those goal areas. Another source of information that we use, and it's probably the most influential, to be honest with you, in terms of assigning points, is the conditions and trends indicators that are produced by our research team to represent existing conditions on the ground related to transportation system performance or sort of the land use characteristics around the roadway network. So the results of the analysis that they do is what we upload to the apply.nashvilleinpo.org app, which is appended to your project at the bottom of your project sheet. So we take that data that describes performance and conditions, both existing and projected into the future, to arrive at our assessment of a great deal of the scoring factors that we just talked about. And then the third source of information is the staff qualitative assessments that are being conducted that Sean has talked about in previous meetings, where for each project that was submitted, we have staff going in and looking at the potential that project has for addressing regional goals and objectives, the potential that project has for causing disruption to vulnerable communities or environmental assets. And then they're also looking to find opportunities to enhance the outcomes of your projects through recommending back to you improved project design or scoping considerations. And so these are the three sources of information that allow us to put numeric values to the elements within the scoring categories that I just mentioned. And then this next slide, Sean, is a look at the tool that is sort of the front door to the tool that we're using to do all the calculations. It's basically a spreadsheet model. And I'm not seeing that slide, Sean. There you go, perfect. So this is basically just a screenshot from the main page of this spreadsheet modeling tool, where we go in by category. And so you see the 6 goal areas here. They're color coded, and you'll recognize this color coding as we go through the process. And from this point forward, these colors will be associated with each of their goal areas. But within each one of those, you can see here the specific variables from the data sets that we're pulling in to calculate the score for each category. And so if anybody's interested in seeing this workbook, it's something we're willing to share, but it's not something that we're going to go through today. And so if you go on to the next slide, let me talk a little bit about how we'll ultimately do our ranking. And so, back in the development of the 2035 plan, what we ended up doing was calculating scores for all 300 plus projects and then essentially publishing the raw score and then sorting the list, rank order, highest to lowest score. We changed that approach through the development of the 2040 plan, where we got away from the raw score, because I think the raw score is a bit distracting and really unimportant in terms of trying to figure out what it is that we're going to be funding. So instead, what we did is we came up with a 5-tier project ranking system for the 2040 plan that we will apply for the 2045 plan. And the 5 tiers include, at the top, 5-star projects, which are consensus priorities per regional policies. And these tend to be sort of the grand visionary projects that we know we need to be accomplishing over the next 25 years that have a lot of consensus behind them. And I'll give you an example of this. And so with the 2040 plan, one of these was the upgrade and modernization of the downtown interstate loop. So that was a 5-star project. It didn't matter how that project scored through the process. It was a policy priority to make that sort of a headline of our regional transportation plan. Also following this category tends to be recommendations and projects that stem from the regional corridor studies, where we're looking to introduce high capacity or rapid transit in the main regional corridors. And so those types of projects are what will be ultimately sort of the leading headline priorities of our plan and would be ranked at the top of our list as a 5-star project. The next tier are what we call the 4-star projects, which are essentially existing projects with programming history. So regardless of how a project scores through the process I just described, if there is a previous commitment and that project remains in good standing without any fatal flaws, it will be programmed in the plan as a 4-star priority project, regardless, again, of how it scores. Now, within the 4-star category, projects would be ranked according to the star, but they will all be in this second tier, regardless of their score, compared to projects that are outside of this tier. So then we get into the sort of the next category of tiers, which are the where we take generally speaking, the new starts projects, or projects that have no programming history, but they have been submitted as sort of the next in line investments for our region. We then sort those by project score and then group them into 3 tiers according to just the breaks and thirds. And so the new starts projects scoring the top third would become 3-star projects, and then so on and so forth. So in the end, what we're going to be doing is, as we apply the limited funding for the projects that are competing for it, we'll start at the top of this tier list and work our way down. And then in the end, we'll have, likely somewhere in the order of 80% of the projects that we're looking at funded and programmed into the RTP. And then, about 20% of the projects ultimately will not be awarded funding through this 25-year schedule, but will continue to be identified as an important priority for the region in an illustrative sort of unfunded priority. So we make sure we're continuing to communicate the investments that are needed, regardless of the amount of money that we have available to get those things done. So again, this is a 5-tier project ranking system that was used for the 2040 plan that will be adapted to the 2045 plan. So let's get to then a look at the preliminary results. If you go to the next slide, Sean, this is a screenshot from one of the handouts that we produced during the countywide workshops for the 2040 plan about 5 years ago. I'll give you a sense of, let me walk you through kind of these columns and what we're looking at. There's a little bit of lag on my end, Sean, so if you haven't changed the slide, if you could go ahead and do that now. Perfect. All right, so what you're looking at here is basically a simplified project list. And so we have obviously a lot more details for each of the projects that would be represented by this list, but it's sort of just slimmed down so that your eyes can instead focus on the result of the scoring. So there's just enough information about what the project is so you can understand what we're talking about. But let's focus instead on the last few columns, starting with the column that is labeled tier. And so this is when you get the list here in a second. Again, this is a sample from the 2040 plan. You're going to want to first look at the tier column, and this is going to tell you the current thinking in terms of where your project is falling within that 5-tier system according to the sort of the parameters that I just described for determining those. And then for the next few columns there where you see the color coding and the plus, minus, and equal signs, what this is going to be is a column for each of the goal areas, and there are 6 of them this time. So we went from, I guess there were like 8 goal areas last time, 8 or 9. We've collapsed that down to 6 through the new policy framework. And so for each one of those goal areas, your project will have a score. Those are then added together according to the distribution of weights that the policy board has endorsed to a total score, which is going to lead to the tier that's assigned to you. But what we want to communicate is how well your project is scoring within each goal area relative to other projects. And so the way to read this is within, say, that first column, which back in 2040 was system preservation, this first project on the list scored higher than average in this category, but it scored lower than average in the multimodal category. And then obviously the equal sign with the gray color coding is where the project scored at or about average compared to other projects for that category. So it's a good way to see where your project is doing well, or where maybe it's not as productive as others for goal areas. And so that's how to read this. And so with that, Sean's going to go ahead and post the URL to access the initial results from the scoring model. I want to, we'll talk about this in a second in terms of what our remaining steps are. But we want to go ahead and share with you what we're seeing in the scoring models. We just ask that you understand that it will continue to change over the next few days as we continue to get information in from project sponsors and our staff finish up their work with the quality of assessments. So that URL, I think it's in the chat box now, but I'll say it out loud so you can get to it. It's at gnrc.org/sample RTP scores. So if you go there now, you'll be able to see the first look at how your projects are doing within the context of the scoring methods. This sheet, once you access it, it is sorted by applicant alphabetically, and then by the improvement type, which is the proposal column on the handout. So it's going to be at the top of the list. You're going to see City of Brentwood, and then you're going to see their projects sorted by the improvement type. And those are things like, roadway traffic operations is a type, roadway widening is a type. The one improvement type I'll make mention of here, because most of these are self-evident, is roadway multimodal. That's the category where we're trying to capture basically capacity improvements to the roadway network that are inclusive of bike ped accommodations. So that's the distinction between that and a traditional roadway widening project. If you see any coding on any of this with respect to improvement type that just doesn't make sense to you, feel free to reach out to our staff. We're still going through a bit of QC on this. And so as those categories change, it could have a ripple effect on the results that you're seeing. One more thing I'll say about this initial look at the model results is that the model results are really only applicable to projects that are on the transportation network. So, and this is not different from last time. And last time we had a conversation about how like off-system greenways or projects that seek to acquire new or replace transit vehicles or programmatic investments or planning studies, those things are not, they don't fit the scoring model, because the scoring model is weighted heavily towards the conditions on the ground in the area in which that project's going to be implemented. So we'll have a different process for sorting out the priorities for transit investments, for example. And we can have that conversation this morning if you like. It's just not the emphasis of our workshop today. So as you go through here, don't be misled into thinking that multi-use pathways and greenways or transit related investments are scoring poorly. We've just basically zeroed out the scores across the goal areas for those types of projects just because the model doesn't fit programmatic or sort of equipment type purchases. So with that, I'll pause here for any immediate questions or comments. Again, if you've been around for at least one cycle, this probably looks familiar to you. We understand it's complex. It's not complicated. It's not hard to figure out, but it's a lot of moving parts here. It might take you some time to come up with those questions or comments, so we'll be patient. Let me go to the final slide that I have for you. And that is a quick look at the remaining work and next steps. So Sean, if you go ahead and continue on to the next slide. I want to emphasize here that these are preliminary results that are going to be impacted by the remaining work. So the sort of top of the list is that we're still finalizing project details. And so we're in conversation still with some of the project sponsors to make sure we either understand what you're proposing, or in some cases, we're coming back to you saying, okay, this project it's not workable, right? Like it doesn't have logical termini, for example, which is a requirement for federal funding, is that you have to start a project and end a project according to sort of predetermined rules. You can't stop a highway expansion project, for example, at a county line. You've got to sort of connect that improvement to the next major intersection, for example, or stop short of that county line, but terminate it at a node, if you will, on the network. So that's an example of what I mean by logical termini. So those types of things are going to impact scoring as we kind of get through the conversations that we're having with sponsors about project scope. The other thing that we have left to do is, I think we're getting very close, but staff is wrapping up now the qualitative assessments. Some of this is, it's dependent on having good project information. So it's difficult to assess projects where there's still a lot of ambiguity about what's being proposed. And so completing the staff qualitative assessments is something that's just going to lag behind that first bullet there. But both of these are very important in terms of the score calculations. And so the results are going to continue to change as the inputs are changing as a result of those two processes. This third bullet here is a next step for you. So just like we did with the development of the 2040 plan, we provide an opportunity for you as a community. So if you're Metro, for example, we don't mean like Public Works, Planning, Mayor's Office, Parks and Rec individually. We mean Metro government as a whole. We would ask each community to get together, and by community, I mean municipality or county government, and determine, if you've applied for multiple projects, which one of those is your top priority. And whichever project you identify as your top priority will get some additional points within the goal area number 6, which is aligning with other plans. And so that's not accounted for yet because we haven't asked that question for this round of the plan update. So you might go back to your records last time, or we can tell you what you identified as your top priority last time. But regardless, you have an opportunity to sort of start anew and identify your top priority. And one of the reasons we do this is because we understand that sort of a regional perspective isn't always going to align with the local perspective, and we don't want to disrespect your local perspective in this process. So we want to account for that. It just can't override what we're trying to do at a regional scale, because and so again, this is not an overriding factor, but it is a way of accommodating some of the secondary goals that we have with our RTP. And then the final step here is, once we've got all the inputs in place, which are the 3 top bullets here, we'll need to go in and do the final calibration of the scoring model, just to make sure that the lists that is being produced passes sort of a logic test, if you will. And it's already performing pretty well, but we're still waiting on inputs, so it's too soon to judge its performance until all those things are in place. So once that final scoring model is calibrated, and this is expected to happen in the next week and a half or so that we can produce that first list for the Transportation Policy Board at their October meeting coming up here on the 21st, I believe. Sean, that's the presentation this morning for item number 1, and I'll stand by for any questions or comments that anybody has this morning.
Looks like we have a question.
Yeah, this is Bill McCord. Just wanted to make sure that we were going to get the link to that listing that was shown, I guess, on the previous slide for the whole MPO area that we could review. You mentioned a website, but I was just wondering if we were going to be sending an email with a link to it so we don't have to search around for it.
Well, it's posted in the chat, Bill, but I'll read it again. GNRC.org/sample RTP scores. But if you go to the chat, you should find the URL there.
Okay.
And Sean, go ahead and post it again just in case anybody's joined since, because I know if you join after something's entered into the chat, you don't have access to it.
Okay, I just added it again, Bill.
Got it. Thank you.
Just be mindful, if you begin to share this with anybody that wasn't part of today's meeting, that it's got the word sample in the file name for a reason, and we don't want to miscommunicate anything because we shared that document with you.
Hey, Michael, Ken Moore.
Hey, Mayor.
I just took a quick glance at the worksheet, and there are projects that that I saw on there that are projects that are still, some of them are in right-of-way acquisition, some of them are still in design, but there's some that I did not see on those, such as widening of Southeast Mac Hatcher Parkway, which I think TDOT is allocated some funding for. Is that because it's a state project or
Yeah.
What,
Yes, sir. So, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. So if you go to page 11, you'll see that as project number 2858, and it's just within the TDOT category because they were the ones who submitted the application.
Okay, so we need to be looking for not only our city within the county, but also further through the document, which is, I haven't gone all the way through it. I just went to the first page.
Yes,
okay,
sir.
That helps.
Now, in terms of just seeing what projects are out there, probably the best way to do that is through the website, which is more interactive. It's got a map, an interactive map, and then it's also got like a set of filters. And so if you're wanting to kind of get a sense of what projects that we're even looking at, if you go to I may need to get you a login, or you can request a login at the URL. But if you go to apply.nashvillempo.org, that's probably a better tool for just getting a sense of what's out there. It's also where you can see what's being proposed, and you can see the sort of the data analysis that we did that describes the existing conditions.
Well, this is really good information, I think, and it helps us better understand all the processes involved. Also, not
Well, I lost you a little bit there, Mayor, at the end, but we appreciate you looking at this closely, and welcome any feedback you want to give us on this in the next few weeks.
Hi, Sean. This is Katrina Jones. So for some of these projects where we have multiple phases of work grouped together, if a particular phase is of a higher priority than the other phase that is grouped with, will that be looked at differently when you, I guess, get with us one-on-one for these to calibrate the scoring?
I can take that, Sean, take the first stab at that if you want from a historical perspective. So Katrina, this is Michael still. So historically what we would have done is, that reconciliation between phases and the scheduling is something we would do, not really the calibration of the scores, but as we go to allocate funding. So obviously, like what we're not going to want to do is allocate funding to the third phase of a 4-phase project that depends on phases 1 and 2 to move forward. So that's where, when we get into the list, and we're like, okay, we're about to fund phase 3. And we're like, okay, we can't do that until phase 1 and 2 are started. So we will come talk to you then about linking those projects.
Okay, and then
so in the RTP, what we may do, I'm sorry, Katrina, one more thing. So in the RTP, we may then like update the list to make them all one project, and then begin to program them in phases, if that makes sense.
Yes. Then my other question is for the tip ID column there. Some of them you say that there was no tip ID. So are you only like showing the ones that are in the short term? Because I know I provided tip IDs for majority of those.
So the tip ID column is basically, does this project have a tip ID? I'm going to go to Sean here in a second, but I think that we QC this. So regardless of what you may have submitted to us, we would have captured the tip ID. Some of these projects have multiple tip IDs, and we're only showing the first one. So if you see a comma at the end, that means there are probably other tip IDs there. It just isn't important to this list. But if it says no, it is our understanding that it has not been in the tip yet.
Okay, thank you.
It doesn't mean it's submitted. It just means in our assessment, it's not been programmed and assigned a tip ID.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Sean, can you verify that this is what we have verified versus what was submitted in the application?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think the tip ID that we have in that column it's in the current tip, so the 20 to 2023. There may be some projects that were programmed in prior tips that people may have entered those tip IDs, and I think we were focusing on what's programmed in the current tip. Michael, Kevin Rigsby had a question. Could you just reiterate the explanation for the transit and greenway projects not being assigned to tiers?
Yeah, it's more to do with they're not being given scores within the goal areas, and so without a score, you can't really be in a tier unless you're in the tip. So if you're in the tip, you would be tier 4 regardless of whether you're a greenway or a roadway widening project. But we removed the tiers from the sheet just so it wasn't confusing. So the issue is that the way we score projects through the model that I've described today, and it's not the only way we score projects, but it's how we score sort of the on-system investments, is that we need to have a definitive location for a project in order to assess like how well it's going to be addressing congestion in that area that might exist, or to know sort of contextually what the growth and development looks like around it. So programmatic investments or like vehicle acquisitions or off-system greenways, we're not able to apply the scoring model to. And this is not new. This was an issue last time around. So we sort of account for prioritization of greenway projects that are off the system, and the prioritization of for the programmatic investments in transit, we just account for those differently. And part of how we account for that is because those types of projects typically have a dedicated grant program or two. And so they're not always directly competing with a roadway investment for some of the Federal Highway Administration grants that are written very broadly. And then the other way we account for those is that we set aside, and this is an important reminder for everybody, is that of the surface transportation block grant program that is allocated directly to our region, we set aside 30% of that money off the top for separate calls for project for active transportation, transit, technology type focuses. And so if you're a standalone bike ped project or a standalone transit or technology project, 30% of the money we get through the SDVG program will be awarded to those projects through a subsequent action after the plan is adopted.
Hopefully his audio works. I can also try and summarize that in the chat box as well.
Great, and we may want to, start a running list of Q&A in written form that we can just keep building on and recirculating every time we distribute a scoring handout. So it's always an attachment, sort of a FAQ, if you will. So, I guess I'll close then this item by saying that really the point of sharing the results with you today, there are 2 points. One, just so that you can see the progress that's been made and begin to wrap your head around the methods. But B, maybe more importantly, it's so that you can get eyes on your projects and just help us make sure we're not missing anything or mischaracterizing anything that we understand. So that really is part of the quality control process, is to make sure we're not misinterpreting or overlooking. And also, if you're scoring really low and you think you ought to be scoring better, then it could be a data issue. Like, we can't reward points within a category if we just don't have the information that tells us that your project is indeed going to be helping in that area. So like the granularity with which we are provided the information through the application system is certainly an influence on the score, regardless of what you have in your mind in terms of what that project's going to do on the ground when you get to it. All right, thank you, Sean.
All right, thank you, Michael. So just to continue on, Michael talked a little bit about how staff's evaluation is important to the process. One objective of that analysis is to factor into the evaluation scoring process to inform the rankings. But another objective, and one that we think is probably even more important, is identifying the opportunities to enhance the project. In identifying those opportunities that help advance the goals and objectives that we've identified. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are planning to document that analysis for you all so that it's fairly easy to digest and can be kind of an ongoing, an immediate resource as well as an ongoing resource as the project continues to advance through the project development process. And so, as I mentioned, focus on identifying the opportunities to enhance the project. That's what I'm going to focus on. And it really spans a lot of the different goal categories that we've touched on today. Steps analysis is identifying opportunities to enhance the project across safety, to address some of the roadway safety issues in a project area, or to improve safety specifically for bicycle and pedestrian users. addresses congestion. It looks at congestion by identifying how we can help, manage current or future traffic congestion, and particularly looking at some of those different strategies to address congestion. So looking beyond just adding roadway capacity, but what are potential transit options? Could managed lanes be considered, or other components to support the efficient movement of freight? Also, kind of on the freight topic, looking at state of good repair. Are there any opportunities to extend the useful life of the infrastructure? And then kind of getting into the plans and policies. Are there opportunities to complement existing land uses within a project area, or to support planned growth within that area? And as we get further down the list into the environment, looking at how that project could minimize some of the environmental impacts within the project area, and help ensure kind of equitable and healthy access to opportunities, as well as minimizing some of those freight related impacts within an immediate project area, and minimizing those impacts to the community. And so staff is continuing to wrap up this analysis, going through projects one by one. Has taken quite a bit of time, but I think that what we can do today is summarize some of what we have identified thus far. I think there are quite a few common considerations and items that staff have raised that continually come up. And so what we've tried to do is break it down by some of those goal categories, or perspectives that staff is viewing the projects from. And so looking at these kind of one by one, congestion being one, some of the common considerations as we look project by project, and some of these vary by project type. I think staff has focused a majority of its attention, or had the most number of comments and considerations for roadway capacity adding projects. They tend to be complex projects, and there also tends to be more opportunities to incorporate additional proposed improvements. And so some of those considerations focus on supporting the shift to alternative modes, and some of the example strategies that could be increasing transit service, or providing a dedicated transit lane, or even at the intersection level, just improving transit signal priority, or implementing transit signal priority. Also along the lines of supporting the shift to alternative modes would be incorporating bicycle and pedestrian facilities, particularly if there are opportunities to connect to existing transit stop locations. Another common consideration is improving the operations, and a lot of this focus has been on improving access management as a potential strategy within a corridor, particularly if a roadway is adding additional lanes, of making sure that you can preserve that capacity that's being added through better access management. Also, other opportunities for improving operations would be improving traffic signal coordination, or implementing ITS improvements. And then just some other items that we've identified are particularly at new interchanges, identifying opportunities for additional transit stops, or park and ride facilities. And then kind of moving down the list, focusing on freight, I think some of the common considerations for projects as we look at it from a freight lens is supporting truck movement, and that could be through just appropriate design standards to support trucks. That could be turning radius, appropriate turning radius for trucks, or the roadway composition to support future wear and tear from high truck volumes within a project roadway area. Also ensuring roadway safety, particularly if there's a high number of trucks within a corridor, and being aware of the kind of the separation of the trucks with other users. That could be with vehicles, or non-motorized users by creating separation between trucks and pedestrians. As we get to the state of good repair, I think some of those common considerations include a lot of addressing outdated or inadequate infrastructure, and that could be through improving outdated intersections, and also looking at it from a potential bus stop improvements. And I think some of these components would rely on coordination across agencies. So maybe if TDOT or the local was a project proponent, coordination with WEGO or other transit agencies on potential improvements as a project advances through the development process. Moving down the list, we talked a little bit about active transportation, but looking a little bit more in depth on that, some of the common considerations have been to improve active transportation options through either sidewalks or pedestrian signalization and crossing improvements to improve safety for non-motorized users. Also ensuring safe access through physical separation from vehicles, and that could be a number of different ways or strategies to implement that, but sometimes we've proposed or suggested a multi-use path instead of a sidewalk, or buffering, providing some separation between travel lanes and bike lanes, incorporation of separation through a median or planting strips and things like that. And then also just enhancing the connectivity of the active transportation network. And that could be, taking a look at some of the existing facilities within the area, and if there's greenways, considering the continuation of those facilities so that there's consistency for the user. We've also looked from the equity lens at improving active transportation, particularly for vulnerable users. If you'll recall from our presentation over the last 2 months on equity, a lot of the vulnerable populations prioritizing walking, biking, transit use, and so looking at different opportunities to improve those pedestrian crossing improvements. Some of the items that we mentioned in the active transportation, there's some overlap there. Also some in the importance of connecting to those transit stops. And then I think another good one that's been identified throughout as future consideration is, as we've identified a number of vulnerable populations within project areas, is as that project advances to really seek out stakeholder engagement opportunities through public outreach as the project advances. And then the last two, environment, focus primarily on minimizing the environmental impacts to land, water, and habitat. And some of the strategies that have been identified as for projects is avoidance of some of these, land, water, and habitat, particularly floodplain areas, and the impact that those might that projects might have on drainage in the area, particularly those areas with in close proximity to streams or water bodies, and to ensure that we're addressing water quality concerns within the project area. Two other items that have been identified is the further environmental analysis, particularly for larger projects that are more complex, the road widenings, new roadway extension projects, or new interchanges, I should say. And then as part of that too, further community and environmental engagement, reaching out to the appropriate stakeholders as the project advances. And then lastly, just the ensuring, during these high rain events, making sure that the roadway can continue to operate. So that's another consideration that's been raised. And then lastly, on planned growth, I think this is where we've emphasized the coordination of land use and transportation, making sure that we're managing access for future growth and development, and be mindful of that as we're making transportation investments and improvements. And then working with the existing land owners as well to ensure that we're maintaining connections, but also doing it in a way that supports the existing land uses. And then also what we've identified is just maintaining the access or incorporating opportunities for streetscaping or other placemaking opportunities that are consistent with the particular character area. Some of these are identified in existing local plans and policies, and so just making sure that we're aligning with those objectives. So as you can see, there's been a number of comments that are raised, and they vary across some of the project types, but the next steps that staff is focused on is to make this information available, so to summarize those responses for each individual project. And the idea would be to summarize it, distill it down for you all into a summary form that we can then upload to the Apply app. And the idea with that is to keep staff's analysis contained with the other information about the project. You all have submitted, project narratives and budgets, and so we think of this as another component that could add to that existing information and be housed in one location that's easy to find. And then staff will be available to discuss some of these considerations and how they could potentially be incorporated into the project scope. And I think there's opportunities, in the immediate term to respond to some of these considerations and potentially modify scope changes. But I think what we are also thinking is that there's even more opportunities long-term as the project moves through the project development process, where you can have the opportunity to modify those as the project, or consider some of those considerations as the project advances through the NEPA stage, or further through the design of the project development. So that's what we had in mind there on kind of the other use and potential outcomes for the staff analysis. I'll just mention, in our thinking here of summarizing the staff analysis would be to, for this particular project, there's a file link where you've provided your narrative and budget, and this is where we could upload our staff analysis for you all to read and consider, and to support future conversations between staff and the project proponents. So I think that's all I had on the staff analysis. Was there any immediate questions that folks had regarding that approach? Yes, Bill?
In the environmental analysis, is air quality part of that? Or can that really be assigned to an individual project? I guess it could by traffic volumes or so, but.
Yeah, the air quality is one that we struggle with, just to provide a project by project level assessment on the impact of air quality that we feel very good about. As you know, often some of these road widening projects or capacity adding projects are not modeled independently, but more as a set of investments, and so it's hard to tease out one project from the next on the impact that they would have. But generally, we have been looking at that, at least from a qualitative assessment side, based on our professional assessment, what the likely impact that we think we would see based on what's being proposed as part of the project. But we haven't done any project level assessments or estimates on air quality impacts.
Mm.
Is there any other questions? So the last thing that we wanted to touch on at today's workshop is the cost estimation and the verification of cost estimates. As we get into actually a fiscally constrained plan and identifying projects that will be able to contain in the fiscally constrained list, cost estimates and programming those projects out based on year of expenditure become really important. I think we want to have reasonable and realistic expectations of what we will be able to fund and commit to, over the life of the plan, based on the available revenue that we're working with, and the impact of us not having good handles on the cost estimate is that if we overcommit or overestimate projects, then we'll have less available funding for other projects, or we'll be less likely to implement more projects in the short or midterm. But I think also if we're underestimating some of those projects, then we won't have enough funding available for projects when they actually are ready for construction. And so I'm going to walk through a couple, our approach to the verifying some of the cost estimates that we've received. And so kind of the first source of project information is that we ask all of the project proponents through the call for projects to submit their, best guess of cost estimates. And those cost estimates range from very solid, design level estimates to rough planning estimates for projects that are more conceptual and haven't advanced very far through the project development process. And so that first that's the first source of project estimates that we can work with. And we've received some updates from you all through the county workshops in July, which were very helpful. But we're also going to take another look and kind of vet that project cost estimate that you've provided with a couple of different tools. One is that we have an estimation tool, cost estimation tool that we've worked with Neil Schaefer consulting firm on. And this takes a lot of, it relies on information that TDOT and their cost estimation tool has, or latest cost estimates rely on for, just the cost of materials for projects that are being let for construction. And so this estimation tool builds off of that, looks at the different project types, the length of the project, the number of travel lanes proposed, number of intersections, and several other components like bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And then based on those components, it will estimate a project cost. And so what we'll be using that tool for is, projects that have been submitted where there might not be an estimate available or only a rough planning estimate. We'll run those projects for through the tool to get an estimate that we can use for comparison purposes against what's been provided by the proponent. And then another tool or I guess source of information that we'll pull from is more on a comparable project, or looking at comparable comps. And this one's more, if the estimation tool estimate still doesn't give us confidence, then we would look to this other source, and that would be more based on looking at recently completed projects or recently let projects for construction, looking at what the average cost per mile is, and cross-referencing that with with what we have through the other sources of information to come up with a kind of a third estimate to compare against. And so those projects that we would target for that would be, if the cost estimate seems low, then we'd probably resort to that 2B of looking for comparable projects. And all of this is, all of the estimates that we're pulling is to have cost estimates in current day dollars, which leads to the next slide, which will be then what we do with the current day dollar cost estimate is then based on the desired time horizon, or the horizon, the short, medium, long-term horizon that we're going to program the project into as part of the plan. We would then inflate that project out to its year of expenditure. And so this is just a couple of examples of what that would look like. So for projects that are in the short-term horizon of 2025, we would just inflate that project out to the programming year. And the assumptions that we're using for inflating out to year of expenditure would be 4% a year. So for 2025, given that those are short-term priorities, and say we had a $10 million project, then depending on if it was in 2020 or 2025, that year of expenditure costs would then range between $10 and $12 million. As we get to the 2035 time horizon, we'll continue to inflate out the project by 4% a year. And instead of going all the way to 2035, we'll just take the midpoint of that time horizon, which would be 2030. And then looking at that cost estimate, still using the $10 million example, but based on year of expenditure, it'd be closer to 15 million. And then similarly for 2045, continue to inflate by 4% a year to the midpoint of 2040. And then that 10 million would then inflate out to almost 22 million by 2040. So that's the approach and the method that we would be using. And so when you start to see, as we get through this list of projects starting to be identified by time horizon, their current day dollars, and then their year of expenditure dollars, you'll have a sense of kind of our background and methodology for that. Is there any questions on either the cost estimation or the year of expenditure details that we mentioned here? And we'll be sure to reach out to you all with questions as we go through, and potentially poll or review the cost estimates from these different sources to get a sense to which ones we're confident in, and to make sure that you all are confident in those as well. The final thing I just wanted to mention today, quick reminder that the Transportation Alternatives Program, the application process is wrapping up at the end of this week. So if you have a candidate project, please make sure that you submit that to TDOT. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is that we will be meeting again next week for a regular TCC meeting on October 7th. We'll begin at 10:30. Bill, did you have a final question, or is that raised hand just from earlier?
I think that was a raised hand from earlier, although I want to ask a question about the earlier presentation about the cost feasible projects. Will we be able to compare the projects that made the cost feasible list with this new draft to the existing plan easily? I mean, it seems like money's getting short, and some of these projects that are cost feasible now may fall off the list.
I think probably the easiest way to identify that would be, we have a column for a column for the RTP ID. And what we can clarify on that is, if the project was on the cost feasible list in the 2040 RTP, or if it was on the illustrative list. or the unfunded list. So that way we won't lose track of how things change between last plan and this plan.
Okay.
Any other questions? We will be sure to send a follow-up email to today's workshop with, not only the project list, but also some of the follow-up action items that we identified today, such as identifying the local priority for your community on the list. But we appreciate you all taking the time with us today. I know that we've asked a lot of your time recently, but we hope that getting a draft plan endorsed and next month for state and federal review will hopefully start moving toward in the right direction to wrapping up the 2045 RTP effort. Thank you all.
Thank you.